fragile truce between Washington and Tehran is set to lapse on April 22nd, 2026. And as the clock runs down, the world is watching whether diplomacy will find a last-minute foothold or whether the guns will fall silent only briefly before the next round of fighting. Over the past 7 weeks, what began as a swift and violent exchange on February 28 has hardened into a grinding campaign and a diplomacy conducted at arm's length, mediated by others, leaked in fragments, and fought over in public statements and naval maneuvers. On the battlefield, Iran has framed the last weeks as part of a sustained named campaign, a sequence of missile and drone salvos it calls Operation True Promise 4, a series of waves that Tehran says have targeted American and Israeli positions across the region. On the diplomatic front, Pakistan has played a central role as intermediary and broker. The 2-week ceasefire that began on April 8 was secured through Islamabad's intercession. That pause bought tea, but did not produce a deal. Now, with the ceasefire window ending, both capitals are issuing blunt public warnings while their negotiators move in fits and starts behind the scenes. The United States prepared a delegation that was expected to be led by Vice President J.D. Vance. But that plan is now in doubt. US officials announced that the Vice President has cancelled a planned trip to Pakistan, complicating a fragile negotiating track and narrowing the room for a last-minute agreement. At the same time, Tehran has sent mixed messages about whether it is even willing to sit at the same table. State, media, and senior Iranian officials have pushed back against US demands and accused Washington of pressing a blockade and ultimatums instead of genuine diplomacy. He said no Iranian delegation has gone to Islamabad, Pakistan, neither a main nor subsidiary, primary or secondary one. Those words, broadcast in Tehran's official channels, underscore a fundamental credibility problem. Both sides accuse the other of bad faith, and each public warning deepens mistrust. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman has repeatedly said Tehran will not negotiate under the shadow of coercion. Diplomats in Tehran say attendance in any follow-up talks depends on concrete changes in American actions, particularly the naval posture in and around the Strait of Hormuz. Esmail Bagay said, "We are confronted with a violation of the ceasefire at a time during a period when this pause was supposed to be in effect. We are, witnessing a ceasefire violation in Lebanon, as well as what they claim is a naval blockade against Iran and an attack on a commercial vessel. All of these actions constitute flagrant violations of international law and the United Nations Charter, and are also a clear and explicit breach of the ceasefire agreement. In such instances, under such difficult circumstances, how can one truly place any trust in America's claims for reconciliation and diplomacy? We are still and remain in a state of ongoing warfare. It is true that a ceasefire has apparently been announced. A ceasefire which, regrettably right from the very start, has seen repeated violations by the United States. We were already confronted with that particular issue. And then came the official announcement that all of Iran's maritime ports and its shipping vessels were going to be specifically targeted by the United States, which, as you can imagine, truly made the entire situation far more complex. For as long as this situation persists, then we cannot unilaterally regard in, let's talk about the normalization of traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. That formal line from Tehran's foreign ministry spokesperson captures how Tehran sees the US maritime posture, not as a confidence-building step to secure passage and trade, but as an escalation that fatally undermines negotiations. Washington, for its part, says the naval measures are intended to pressure Iran's capacity to sustain an extended campaign and to stop shipments that could sustain its war effort. The US has enforced a blockade-like line and interdicted multiple vessels it assessed were moving contraband or avoiding restrictions. Those actions have triggered retaliatory rhetoric and, on occasion, retaliatory strikes. President Donald Trump has framed the USS position in stark terms. He has repeatedly insisted that the United States will not accept conditions it judges to be surrender or weakness. When asked about the state of talks, he issued a plain warning. President Donald Trump said, "If there are no deals with Iran." President Donald Trump said, "If there are no deals with Iran." Chaming tributed, "Lots of bombs will go off. That phrase, delivered in public by the American president, adds force to Tehran's insistence that it will not accept a diplomacy conducted under threats. Iranian commanders and ministers have answered in kind with warnings of their own. They describe a readiness to resume kinetic operations, to target naval assets and merchant shipping, and to tar. A key immediate action should they judge the ceasefire breached. He said, "No, look, I believe the point I just made, that sometimes there's an idiom that says don't untie with your teeth and not that can be untied with your hand here." Anyway, the ceasefire there was established, but it was incomplete. I've already explained exactly what I mean. In what sense? In the sense that we, from our side, said if you don't implement the ceasefire, we will not observe it at all. This means we're starting the war and we're ending negotiations. Both at the same time, we'll end negotiations and we'll start the war. They had only half-heartedly observed the ceasefire. This is just another one of their tricks. But we stood firm and they eventually had to accept it. For this very purpose, we even proceeded to close the Strait of Hormuz. We explicitly informed them that we would indeed close the Strait of Hormuz and we would certainly initiate the war. We utilized every single one of our available resources and we successfully managed to impose our own will and our specific demands. That extended statement, broadcast in Tehran's media, reads as both a description of posture and a threat. Tehran is asserting it has plans, lists and options, and that it will not be backed into a settlement framed as capitulation. In practice, that posture has translated into two parallel tracks: a sustained Iran-run missile and drone campaign aimed at US and Israeli assets, and a maritime test of US assets and a maritime test of USSAZ. Control over vital shipping lanes. Over the last week, a string of incidents at sea has become the clearest sign that the maritime dimension could be the immediate flashpoint. US forces disabled and seized an Iranian-flagged container vessel that, according to American accounts, attempted to run a blockade intended to isolate military logistics and sanction evading shipments. Tehran called the seizure an act of piracy and said it would be met in kind. In the face of the interdiction, other Iranian-flagged cargo ships have tried alternative routes, and at least one, a general cargo vessel identified in Iran's reporting as Shoja 2, was tracked moving through the Strait of Hormuz, sailing from a Bandar Abbas port toward Indian waters despite the US blockade effort. Those passages are not merely technical details about shipping. The Strait of Hormuz handles a sizable share of the world's energy flows. Any sustained disruption there would ripple through global markets and the economies that depend on uninterrupted tanker traffic. Policymakers in Asia, Europe and the Gulf have been watching these crossings like hawks. An Iranian convoy that slips past a blockade without incident is a tangible test of US resolve and of Iran's ability to keep its exports flowing despite pressure. An interdiction that results in damage, death or the capture of sailors could be a casus belli. On the diplomatic calendar, Islamabad remains the center of gravity. Pakistan's mediation produce. The temporary ceasefire and Pakistan's officials say they will continue to press for talks and restraint. Pakistan's leaders privately and publicly urge both sides to keep statements measured, warning that public threats could harden positions and torpedo diplomacy. United Arab and European capitals have also urged Tehran to come to Islamabad for talks and have tried to shape a path forward that would allow both sides to claim face-saving outcomes. But even the promise of a face-saving exit clashes with events on the ground. Iran's military command has said in domestic and regional broadcasts that it has spent the past fortnight drawing up new target lists and reconfiguring operational plans to be ready to escalate quickly. On the other side, US says and allied forces remain deployed around key bases and at sea, calculating that a robust posture will deter the most aggressive Iranian moves. Those calculations, of course, are made under enormous uncertainty. Intelligence estimates missy. Air defense performance and the fog of war all tilt the margin for error sharply. For now, the last 2 weeks' pause delivered a narrow opening for diplomacy. It failed to yield a comprehensive settlement. It did, however, create multiple points of contact, with Pakistan as interlocutor, with occasional back-channel communications, and with regional powers attempting to stitch together guarantees or to broker specific confidence-building measures. Yet the substance of those proposals remains contested. Tehran rejects what it calls excessive demands. Washington says it cannot accept arrangements that leave Iran's offensive capabilities intact and unmonitored. The practical effect is that the two sides are negotiating while publicly undermining one another. Each public accusation makes the other less likely to accept the political costs of compromise. And when naval operations and seizures happen in real time, they create immediate and concrete grievances that are hard to paper over, where the diplomatic language, if the ceasefire is not extended or renewed, the models for what comes next are grim but varied. Iran could respond to a perceived breach with intensified strikes on bases, maritime interdictions, and targeted attacks on shipping. The United States could respond with further strikes on Iranian air defenses or missile sites and could broaden the blockade in scope and enforcement. Either side could misread the other's defensive measures as an offensive step, creating a spiral that escalates quickly. There is an alternative, and it still exists. A managed, incremental extension of the ceasefire tied to verifiable steps on the maritime front and to a clear calendar for talks. That would require both a visible reduction in threatening military postures and a credible sequence of confidence-building moves, agreed inspections, agreed safe passages, and carefully staged public messaging. It would also require leadership on both sides willing to accept some political discomfort for the sake of preventing a broader conflagration. As the ceasefire clock approaches zero, both capitals face choices that will resonate well beyond the Gulf. Tehran is framing its next moves as defensive and sovereign, insisting it will not submit to ultimatums and that its maritime lifelines will not be choked off without response. Washington is framing its naval operations and interdictions as necessary to prevent Iran from sustaining what US leaders call an offensive war machine. In the neighborhoods and markets that lie along the Strait's arteries, people already feel the pressure of uncertainty. Insurers raise premiums, charterers delay voyages, and buyers hedge for supply shocks. Global commodity markets price in the risk even before guns are fired. For ordinary citizens in the region, the line between a diplomatic failure and renewed hostilities is terrifyingly short. And yet, even as ships thread through narrow channels and missiles are launched in episodic waves, the channels to stopping a wider war remain open, messy, uneven, mediated by third parties, and fragile. Pakistan's mediators and others in the region have stressed restraint. Their diplomatic work has produced temporary haltings of fire before. Those actors now urge both capitals not only to refrain from striking first, but also to temper their rhetoric and to create a credible, verifiable mechanism for maritime traffic. In the coming hours, the most immediate thing to watch will be whether Islamabad reports an agreed extension or whether either capital announces irreversible steps. If talks resume and produce even a short, verifiable set of commitments on the Strait of Hormuz and on interdictions, the risk to global markets and to lives could be reduced. If not, the next days could see a return to strikes, reprisals, and a much broader set of targets, exactly the outcome both mediators and the broader international community have sought to avoid. What is clear is that both sides have cultivated narratives to justify continued action. Tehran emphasizes resistance and sovereignty. Washington emphasizes the need to deny Iran the ability to fight unchecked and to protect regional partners. Within each narrative, there is an audience that will cheer hardened measures. Within each, there are leaders who still prefer a diplomatic exit. The question now is which impulse will assert itself in the decisive hours ahead. If a deal is to be struck, it will be a papering over mechanism of mutual concessions, timed and monitored and paced with careful neutral verification, a painful political compromise for leaders on both sides. If a deal is not struck, the strategic calculations on the ground will unfold rapidly. First at sea and then across the region. For now, the ceasefire holds on paper until April 22nd. Behind that paper, ships move, missiles are prepared, envoys talk and withdraw, and diplomats in Islamabad, Riyadh, and capitals from Europe to Beijing press both sides privately to step back from the edge. The immediate future rests on decisions being made in 3 places at once: command centers, drawing rooms, and on the decks of ships threading a narrow and vital sea lane. As this hour approaches, one thing remains unmistakable. The moment calls for restraint from the highest political leaders and for careful, calibrated communications that reduce the chance of miscalculation. If words become weapons and public threats outpace private concessions, the brief lull will have been only a prelude. If instead both sides can find a way to trade risky steps for predictable, verifiable ones, the temporary pause may lengthen into a pathway out of a much wider war. The next few hours and the choices made in them will tell which of those two futures will arrive.